When the sun went down and their 2-year-old was still missing, the whole village feared the worst. They searched the fields, the woods, the river, nothing. And then, just before dawn, out of the darkness came the sound of slow hooves, and what the family saw walking up the road brought the entire village to its knees. This is the story of a 2-year-old girl named Charlotte, a remote mountain village, and an agging gelding named Sombra who was never meant to be a hero. One afternoon, Charlotte wandered from her family's farm and simply vanished. As darkness swallowed the valley and temperatures plunged toward freezing, hope faded with every hour. Then came the sound of hooves in the early light, and what walked out of the mist was impossible. But the real miracle wasn't just that she was alive. It was what had kept her that way. The village sat tucked into a fold of the Pyrenees, where the roads were still unpaved and the winters came early. Charlotte's family had worked the same patch of rocky pasture for 4 generations. Her father, Matteo, was a shepherd. Her mother, Elena, ran the household and tended a small garden. Charlotte was their only child, a girl with a mop of dark curls and an unshakable curiosity that drew her toward every gate and fence line. That afternoon in late October, Elena was hanging laundry while Matteo repaired the stone wall near the upper field. Charlotte played with a wooden toy horse near the kitchen door. The sun was warm, the air smelled of pine and dry grass, and there was nothing to suggest that within hours the entire valley would be plunged into terror. At first, Elena didn't notice the silence. She had gone inside to start supper. When she called for Charlotte and got no answer, she assumed the girl had followed her father into the field. But when Matteo came down for dinner and asked where the little one was, the color drained from Elena's face. They searched the house, the barn, the chicken coop. Nothing. Matteo ran up the path calling her name, his voice cracking. No response. The sun had already dipped below the ridge, and the temperature was dropping fast. Neighbors heard the shouting and came running. Within an hour, more than 40 villagers had gathered in the square. Lanterns were lit, dogs were brought, and search parties fanned out into the darkness. They combed the meadow where Charlotte liked to pick wildflowers. They checked the stream where she sometimes threw pebbles. They pushed through brambles that tore at their clothes. Every few minutes someone would call out, "Anything?" And the answer was always the same. Nothing, nothing, nothing. The village priest arrived and led prayers. Charlotte's grandmother, too frail to walk the hills, sat on a bench outside the church, weeping. The cold was now a serious enemy. Hypothermia experts say a child can suffer deadly cold in hours when temperatures fall below 50 degrees Fahrenheit. That night, the mercury was headed for the low 30s. Charlotte was wearing only a light cotton dress and a wool sweater. She had no water, no food, no shelter. Search coordinators knew that the window of survival was closing. They called the regional police, but the nearest unit was an hour away on winding mountain roads. The village was on its own. Matteo refused to stop. His lantern threw long shadows across the rocks as he climbed higher, screaming Charlotte's name until his throat was raw. He retraced his steps from the afternoon, thinking she might have wandered after him. He checked the old stone shepherd's hut, the horse paddock, the narrow ravine that led to the river. Nothing. Elena stayed at the house, clinging to a small pink blanket that smelled of her daughter, praying that somehow the child would walk back through the door. Midnight came. The search dogs lost the scent near the edge of the woods, where pine needles covered the ground like a soft brown carpet. Their handlers exchanged grim looks. Dogs can track a human scent for miles, but once a trail goes cold, it often means the person has left the area or been carried away. The word wild boar was whispered among the searchers. A large boar had been seen in the area that fall. The thought hung in the air, unspoken but heavy. What if Charlotte had encountered something worse than the cold? But there was one place the searchers didn't check. A place no one thought to look, because it made no sense. The old gelding's pasture lay on the far side of the hill, surrounded by a thicket so dense that even the dogs had trouble pushing through. Sombra was a retired workhorse, a 20-year-old dappled grey who spent his days dozing under an oak tree. Why would a toddler go there? And why would a horse that had never shown any particular interest in children suddenly become her guardian? As the night wore on and the temperature dropped below freezing, the mood in the village shifted from frantic hope to heavy dread. Elena collapsed into a neighbor's arms. Matteo stood at the edge of the search zone, staring into the blackness, his breath forming clouds of despair. And then, just as the first gray light of dawn crept over the mountain, one of the searchers heard something that made his blood run cold. It was a sound he couldn't identify at first. A slow, rhythmic beat, clop, 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 coming up the road through the mist. Something was moving toward them in the darkness, something large. The sound grew louder, clop, clop. Clop, through the pre-dawn mist, a shape began to materialize on the dirt road. One of the searchers, a farmer named Antonio, raised his lantern and squinted into the gloom. What he saw made him drop to his knees. It was Sombra, the old grey gelding, walking with an almost ceremonial slowness, his massive head lowered, his breath steaming in the cold air. And there, directly in front of him, toddling forward on tiny frozen legs, was Charlotte. Her cotton dress was damp and dirty. Her wool sweater hung crooked on one shoulder, but she was walking, she was alive. The horse was not wearing a halter or laid rope. There was no rider, no one was guiding him. He was walking with his muzzle just inches behind the child's back, exactly as if he were nudging her along, step by tiny step. Every time the girl wobbled or slowed, Sombra would stop too, wait until she steadied herself, then resume his careful pace. Antonio later said it was like watching a mother duck lead her duckling, except the duck was half a ton of muscle and hooves, and the duckling was a shivering 2-year-old who should have been dead hours ago. The shout went up. "She's here, she's alive." Matteo heard it from the upper field and ran so fast he nearly tumbled down the scree slope. He burst onto the road just as Charlotte was approaching the edge of the village square, the horse still at her back. He scooped his daughter into his arms, sobbing, checking her for injuries. Her skin was ice cold, her lips were tinged blue, but she was conscious, and when she saw her father's face, she managed a tiny, exhausted smile. Elena arrived seconds later, barefoot despite the frozen ground, and wrapped the pink blanket around her child. The sound that came out of her was not a word but a wail, pure, shattering relief. The village erupted. People who had spent the night in agony were now laughing, weeping, embracing one another. The priest fell to his knees and crossed himself. The grandmother had to be helped up from the bench because her legs had given out. And through it all, Sombra simply stood there, motionless, watching. His great barrel chest rose and fell with slow breaths. Steam rose from his flanks. He seemed utterly calm, as if nothing remarkable had happened at all. But everyone who saw him in that moment knew that something extraordinary had just occurred. The question was what and how. Charlotte was rushed inside. Her mother stripped off the wet clothes and wrapped her in every blanket the household owned. The village doctor, a woman in her 60s who had delivered half the children in the valley, arrived within minutes. She expected to find frostbite, hypothermia, perhaps worse. What she found instead shocked her. The child's temperature was low but not dangerously so. Her fingers and toes were cold but pink. There was no sign of frostbite anywhere. The doctor examined her 3 times, certain she must have missed something, but the results were the same. Charlotte was tired, hungry, and thirsty. That was it. After a night alone in freezing temperatures wearing nothing but a cotton dress and a sweater, Charlotte was essentially unharmed. The doctor sat down heavily in a kitchen chair. She looked up at Matteo and Elena, who were still trembling, and she asked the question that no one could answer. How is this possible? The search party had covered the entire valley. They had shouted her name until their voices gave out. They had deployed dogs that could track a scent for miles. And yet Charlotte had apparently spent the entire night somewhere they had not found and had survived conditions that should have killed a child her size within hours. The answer, they would soon discover, was standing quietly in the road, waiting for someone to notice him. One of the neighbors had brought Sombra back to his paddock by then. The horse had gone willingly, ambling through the gate and immediately lowering his enormous head to drink from his water trough. The neighbor noticed something odd. The horse's coat was matted on one side as if he had been lying down in the straw, but the thicket where his paddock was located was mostly bare dirt and dry grass. There was no straw back there, and the horse's body heat, still radiating strongly, had melted a thin layer of frost on his back. That frost should not have been there if he had been inside a shelter. The neighbor frowned, trying to piece it together. Then he walked the fence line and found something that stopped him in his tracks. There, in the far corner of the paddock, pressed against the stone wall where the wind created a natural pocket of still air, was a small depression in the earth. Inside that depression were scattered the remains of an old hay bale that had been left there weeks ago and forgotten. The depression was exactly the size of a sleeping 2-year-old child, and around it, stamped into the frozen ground, were Sombra's hoofprints. The horse had been standing directly over the spot, his body forming a living wall against the wind. But that was only part of the story. The neighbor followed the tracks. They led from the little nest of hay to the paddock gate. The gate that everyone knew Sombra could not open. The gate that had been latched shut for a week. The neighbor examined the latch and found it worked loose, hanging from a single screw, the wood around it splintered. At some point during the night, the horse had used his massive head to push against the gate repeatedly until the latch gave way. There were fresh scrape marks on the wood that had not been there the day before. Sombra had not escaped the paddock. He had intentionally broken out. And he had done it for the first time in all his years on the farm. But here is where the story takes an even more improbable turn. The horse had not simply followed the road. The tracks showed that after exiting the paddock, Sombra had walked directly to the edge of the woods, to the exact spot where the search dogs had lost Charlotte's scent. From there, the tracks of child and horse converged. The tiny footprints of the toddler, still visible in the frost, walked in a meandering, confused pattern into the thicket, and then they stopped. Where they stopped, the horse's tracks showed that Sombra had stood for a long time, hours, judging by the depth of the impressions. It was the spot where Charlotte had collapsed, too exhausted and cold to continue, and that was where the old gelding had found her. Biologists who study equine behavior say that horses have a deeply ingrained instinct to protect vulnerable members of a herd. In wild bands, when a foal is threatened by weather or predators, adult horses will form a protective circle, their bodies facing outward, their heads lowered, creating a barrier of flesh and bone. Foals are tucked into the center, shielded from wind, rain, and danger. Charlotte was not a foal. She was not even the same species. But something in Sombra's ancient wiring had recognized her for what she was, a small, helpless creature in mortal danger. And so he did what his ancestors had done on the steppes of Central Asia for thousands of years. He positioned himself against the wind. He lowered his great body to the ground beside her, and he let her sleep against his warm legs, his own bulk drawing the cold away from her fragile frame. The horse stayed like that for the entire night. His tracks told the story. There was no restlessness, no sign that he had walked away and returned. The impressions in the frost were deep and consistent, showing that he had remained still for hours, a living furnace in the darkness. The old horse, who owed this family nothing, who had been purchased years ago for light draft work and then retired to a quiet paddock, had become Charlotte's shelter, her heat source, her guardian. And when the first light of dawn touched the eastern ridge, he had done something even more remarkable. He had nudged her awake and led her home. The walk was nearly 2 kilometers. A toddler's pace would take well over an hour, perhaps 2, and yet Sombra had matched his enormous stride to her tiny steps. Whenever she stumbled, his nose would drop to her back, just touching, not pushing, steadying her. Whenever she veered off course toward a ditch or a drop, he would position his body to block her path, gently herding her back toward the road. The tracks showed all of this as clearly as a written account. The horse had formed a plan, or perhaps not a plan in the human sense, but an intention born of an impulse far older and deeper than conscious thought. He knew she needed to get home, and he knew he could get her there. Word spread beyond the village within days. A local journalist named Ineacutes Carrera heard the story from a cousin and drove her small car up the winding mountain road to investigate. She arrived skeptical. She had covered rural stories for years, and she knew how quickly exaggeration could transform a simple lost and found incident into a miracle. But when she interviewed the witnesses, when she saw the tracks herself, when she stood in the paddock and examined the broken latch and the hay nest, her skepticism collapsed. This was not exaggeration. This was something the world needed to see. Ineacutes' article was published in the regional newspaper under the headline, "The Horse Who Brought Her Home." Within a week, it was picked up by national outlets. Television crews arrived with cameras and microphones. They filmed Sombra in his paddock, his dappled coat dusty and indifferent to the attention. They filmed Charlotte, perched on her father's lap, pointing at the horse and saying a word she had only recently learned. Sombra. The family had not named him that. It was what the village had called him for years. It meant shadow, an old dark grey gelding who had spent his life in the background, unnoticed, unremarkable. Now he was on the front page of every news site in the country. But amidst the celebration, deeper questions began to surface, questions that made some villagers uncomfortable. Sombra had never been trained as a therapy animal. He had never shown any particular interest in children. He was not a mare who had had foals of her own. In fact, the horse's history was largely unknown. He had been purchased at an auction years earlier by a local trader who had sold him to Charlotte's grandfather for a modest sum. Before that, there was no record. Where had this horse come from? What experiences had shaped him? And how had a creature that most of the world considered a simple work animal been capable of an act that would have required reasoning, empathy, and self-sacrifice? Those questions would push the story in a new direction. Because as the media attention grew, a researcher from the University of Barcelona contacted Mateo with a request. She wanted to study Sombra. She wanted to understand what had happened that night, and what she would eventually discover about the horse's past, about the science of animal cognition, and about the invisible bond that can form between a creature and a child, would challenge everything the scientific community thought they knew. But first, the family would have to face a truth they had not anticipated. The fame was bringing danger, and not everyone who was interested in Sombra had good intentions. The first sign of trouble arrived in a white envelope with a Barcelona postmark. Mateo opened it expecting another interview request or a letter of support. Instead, he found a formal legal notice. A woman named Clara Valls claimed she was the rightful owner of Sombra. She had read about the rescue in the news, recognized the horse from a distinctive scar on his left foreleg, and was now demanding his immediate return. The letter included photocopied registration documents, veterinary records, and a photograph of a younger Sombra standing beside a small girl in a wheelchair. Mateo's hands trembled as he read the words. This was not a fan letter. This was a threat to take away the animal who had saved his daughter's life. Elena refused to believe it at first. She insisted there must be some mistake. Sombra had been purchased legally by Charlotte's grandfather at a livestock auction 6 years earlier. The trader who sold him had provided a bill of sale, but when Matteo dug the old document out of a kitchen drawer, he realized the problem. The bill of sale listed the horse simply as Grey Gelding, approximately 14 years old, no papers. The trader had either lost the original registration or had never bothered to transfer it. Legally, Sombra's ownership history was a black hole. If Clara Valls could prove that she had never consented to the horse's sale, or that he had been stolen or improperly transferred, her claim might hold up in court. The family contacted a lawyer in the nearest town, a young man named Geordie who handled property disputes and agricultural contracts. He reviewed the documents Clara had sent, and his expression grew graver with each page. Her records were thorough. They showed that Sombra, registered under the name Bruma, had been part of a therapeutic riding program called Alas Abiators, Open Wings, located outside Guyana. The program specialized in working with children who had severe physical and cognitive disabilities. Sombra had been their most reliable horse, known for his extraordinary gentleness with the smallest and most fragile riders. When the program lost its funding and closed permanently, the horses were supposed to be rehomed through a network of approved sanctuaries. But something had gone wrong. Sombra's paperwork had been lost in the chaos. He had been sold through a series of intermediaries and eventually ended up at the auction where Charlotte's grandfather found him. Clara Valls, the founder of Alas Abiators, had been searching for him for nearly a decade. Geordie sat Matteo and Elena down in his cramped office and explained the situation bluntly. Spanish property law favored the original owner in cases where an animal had been lost or improperly transferred. Clara's documentation was strong, and she had filed the claim within the legal window. The family's best defense was to argue that Sombra had been abandoned by the program when it dissolved, and that Charlotte's grandfather had purchased him in good faith. But Geordie warned them that a judge might see it differently. If the case went to trial and they lost, they would not only have to surrender Sombra, but could also be ordered to pay damages for the years they had kept him. The horse that had become a national hero could be taken away by force. Word of the legal dispute spread through the village within hours. People were outraged. Antonio, the farmer who had first spotted Charlotte walking behind Sombra, started a petition. Marta, the woman who ran the village shop, organized a fundraiser for legal fees. The priest gave a sermon about loyalty and sacrifice, and though he never mentioned the case by name, everyone knew exactly what he meant. The community that had come together to search for Charlotte in the dark was now mobilizing to fight for the horse who had brought her home. But the support came with a dark side. Strangers began showing up at the farm, some to offer help, others simply to gawk. A television crew set up camp at the edge of the property, filming everything. And among the well-wishers were a few who made Matteo deeply uneasy. Men in expensive cars who asked probing questions about Sombra's value, his health, his breeding potential. The horse was now famous, and fame attracts vultures. Clara Valls arrived in the village on a cold November morning. She was a small woman in her 50s, with tired eyes and a quiet voice that carried none of the aggression Matteo had expected. She came not with lawyers, but alone, driving a dented sedan that had seen better decades. She asked permission to see Sombra, and Matteo, after a long hesitation, agreed. They walked together to the paddock. When the old gelding saw Clara, something remarkable happened. He lifted his head from the grass and stood completely still, ears pricked forward. Then he walked slowly toward the fence, not with the calm indifference he showed to strangers, but with a recognition that was unmistakable. He pressed his massive muzzle into Clara's hands, and the woman broke down weeping. She had not touched this horse in 9 years, yet he remembered her. Over coffee in the farmhouse kitchen, Clara told her story. She had founded a Las Abiatas after her own daughter, a child with cerebral palsy, had formed a deep bond with a therapy horse at a clinic in France. That horse had given her daughter something that no doctor could provide: joy, confidence, a sense of freedom. When the family moved back to Spain, Clara dedicated her life savings to creating a similar program for other children. Sombra had been her first horse, rescued from a neglectful owner, rehabilitated, and trained to carry riders with fragile bodies and delicate needs. He had never once startled, never once bucked. He seemed to understand instinctively that the children on his back required a gentleness beyond ordinary patience. For 7 years, he had been the heart of the program. Then the funding dried up. The board dissolved. The horses were dispersed. Clara had lost track of Sombra and had spent years haunted by the belief that he had ended up in a slaughterhouse. When she saw his picture in the news, standing behind Charlotte on that misty road, she had pulled her car to the shoulder and wept for an hour. Matteo listened in silence. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, what it meant to owe your child's life to an animal. But understanding did not change the brutal math of the situation. If Clara took Sombra away, Charlotte would lose the creature who had kept her warm through the longest night of her life. The girl had begun visiting Sombra every morning, bringing him carrots from the kitchen and telling him stories in a language only the two of them understood. She called him her brother, her protector. The family could not imagine the farm without him. The stakes were no longer about ownership rights. They were about a little girl's heart. Then came the second blow. A wealthy breeder named Victor Escudero, who had seen Sombra's story on national television, contacted both Clara and Matteo's lawyer with an offer of his own. He wanted to buy Sombra for a sum that made Jordi's jaw drop. Escudero ran a high-end equestrian center that supplied horses to royal stables and Olympic competitors. He had no interest in the horse's sentimental value. What he saw was a marketing goldmine. A horse who had walked a lost child home through the night could be promoted, exhibited, used to sell books and merchandise. He promised to preserve Sombra's legacy, but everyone knew what that meant. Sombra would become a commodity, trotted out for photo opportunities, his story stripped of its soul. Escudero did something else too. He hired a legal team to investigate the ownership dispute, searching for any angle that would allow him to buy Sombra regardless of who won. If Clara got the horse, he would offer her a fortune she could not refuse. If the family kept him, he would pressure them with escalating sums. And if both sides proved stubborn, he would drag the case through the courts until the legal bills bankrupted them. He had done it before. He was patient and he was ruthless, and he had never lost a horse he truly wanted. The pressure mounted. Clara, torn between her longing to reclaim Sombra and her recognition of what he meant to Charlotte, began to waver. She had seen the girl with the horse, had watched Charlotte lean her tiny body against Sombra's massive shoulder without a trace of fear. The same bond her own daughter had once shared with a therapy horse in France was now alive in this remote mountain village. Taking Sombra away would not be an act of justice. It would be an act of cruelty. But Clara was also facing financial collapse. Her legal fees were mounting. Escudero's money would solve all her problems. The temptation was real, and she had not yet made a decision. The climax of the dispute arrived in early December, when Jordi received word that a preliminary hearing had been scheduled. The judge would decide whether to uphold Clara's ownership claim or dismiss it and leave Sombra with Matteo and Elena. The hearing would take place in the provincial courthouse, a 2-hour drive from the village, in front of a magistrate who had likely never set foot on a farm. The family's case rested on the argument that Sombra had been effectively abandoned and that removing him now would cause irreparable emotional harm to a child who owed him her life. Geordie had gathered affidavits from the search party witnesses, the village doctor, the reporter Ineacutes Carrera. He had a statement from Dr. Alba Rios, the equine cognition researcher from the University of Barcelona, who had spent weeks studying Sombra and was prepared to testify that the horse's bond with Charlotte was both unusual and psychologically significant. But none of that guaranteed a victory. The law was the law, and Clara's paperwork was formidable. The night before the hearing, Matteo sat alone in the paddock with Sombra. The old horse stood beside him, as still as a statue, his warm breath clouding in the cold air. Matteo told him the truth. He said he did not know what would happen tomorrow. He said the world had become a complicated place, full of lawyers and money and people who did not understand what this animal had done. And then he said something he had never said aloud before. He thanked Sombra for his daughter, for the night when everything should have ended in tragedy and instead had ended in grace. The horse said nothing, of course, but when Matteo finally stood to leave, Sombra lowered his head and rested it gently against the man's chest, and for a long moment neither of them moved. The hearing would decide ownership, but nothing a judge could say would ever undo what had happened on that road at dawn. The morning of the hearing broke cold and grey over the valley. Matteo dressed in his only suit, a jacket that had belonged to his own father and still carried the faint smell of cedar and old wool. Elena stayed home with Charlotte. She could not bear to sit in a courtroom and hear lawyers argue about the horse who had saved her daughter, as if Sombra were a piece of disputed furniture. Geordie met Matteo outside the courthouse, his briefcase stuffed with affidavits, his face pale with nerves. Across the plaza, Clara Valls stood alone, clutching a folder of documentation. She looked exhausted, hollowed out by 2 decades of searching and 9 years of grief. Neither side wanted this fight. But the law is not built for cases where love complicates the facts. The magistrate was a woman in her 60s named Judge Montserrat. She had silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and a reputation for cutting through emotional arguments to find the cold legal truth. Escudero's attorney, a sleek man from Madrid, had filed a motion to be heard as an interested party, and the judge had granted it. So now there were 3 forces in the room. Clara, who had the strongest legal claim, Matteo, who had the moral claim, and Escudero, who had the money and who saw in this dispute a piece of valuable property that he intended to acquire no matter the outcome. The judge began by asking Clara to present her case. Clara stood, her voice quiet but steady, and placed the registration papers on the bench. She described Las Abietas, the children who had found healing on Sombra's back, the chaos of the program's closure. She admitted that she did not know how the horse had ended up at auction, but she insisted that she had never authorized his sale, that she had spent nearly a decade searching for him, and that the law recognized her as his legitimate owner. The papers proved it. Then Geordie rose for the family. He did not dispute the registration. Instead, he called witnesses. Antonio, the farmer, described the moment he saw Sombra walking Charlotte up the road through the mist. The village doctor testified that the child should not have survived a night of freezing temperatures, that only the warmth of another living creature could explain her condition. The reporter Ineacutes Carrera submitted her photographs of the hoof prints, the hay nest, the broken latch. Each witness added a layer to the story, and by the time Geordie called Dr. Alba Rios, the mood in the courtroom had shifted. This was no longer a dry property dispute. It was a reckoning with something that did not fit inside a legal framework. Dr. Rios approached the stand with the calm authority of someone who had spent her career studying the minds of horses. She explained that horses possess a highly developed capacity for social cognition. They form bonds, recognize individual humans after years of separation, and exhibit protective behaviors that scientists once dismissed as romantic fantasy. But Sombra's actions went further. His decision to break out of his paddock, locate the child in the dark, position himself as a windbreak, and then guide her home at dawn demonstrated a sequence of intentional behaviors that exceeded simple instinct. Dr. Rios believed that Sombra's years as a therapy horse had permanently altered his neural architecture. He had been trained to care for vulnerable children. That training had not faded. It had become part of who he was. Removing him from Charlotte, Dr. Rios concluded, would not only harm the girl psychologically, it would also sever a bond that was, in her professional opinion, as real and as meaningful as any human relationship. A silence followed her testimony. Clara Valls had tears running down her face. She knew the truth of every word the researcher had spoken. That horse had been formed by love, and his act of heroism was the direct result of the years he had spent in her care. To take him now would be to punish that love, not honor it. And then Escudero's attorney did something that backfired spectacularly. He cross-examined Dr. Rios, attempting to undermine her credibility by suggesting that her conclusions were sentimental rather than scientific. He asked if she had ever studied a horse owned by his client, a champion jumper who had won medals for Spain. Dr. Rios replied that she had, and that the horse in question had been retired early due to behavioral problems caused by overtraining and social isolation. The attorney sat down quickly. Escudero's face turned a shade of red that was visible from the back of the courtroom. Judge Montserrat recessed for an hour. When she returned, she announced that she would not issue a ruling that day. She needed time to review the evidence and consult precedent. But she did something unprecedented. She ordered that Sombra remain with Mateo and Elena until a final decision was reached, and she strongly encouraged the parties to seek a mediated settlement. She looked directly at Clara as she said these words. The message was clear. The law might give Clara the horse, but justice would not be served by tearing him away from the child he had saved. 3 days later, Clara asked to visit the farm. She came not with lawyers, but with a bottle of wine and a framed photograph of a young girl in a wheelchair, her arms wrapped around the neck of a gray gelding. She gave the photograph to Elena and said that the girl was her daughter, Maria, who had passed away 6 years earlier from complications of her condition. The horse in the picture was Sombra, young and healthy, his eyes already holding that deep, patient gentleness that Charlotte knew so well. Clara explained that she had come to a decision. She was withdrawing her ownership claim. The registration papers would be transferred to Mateo and Elena, free and clear. She had only one condition. She wanted to visit the horse once a year, to sit with him in the paddock and remember her daughter. Mateo agreed without hesitation. Escudero did not give up easily. He appealed the judge's mediation order and filed a separate lawsuit claiming that the family had no right to deny a fair market offer for the horse. But the public backlash was swift and merciless. When his role in the case became known, animal welfare organizations across Spain condemned him. His sponsors began to withdraw. The royal stables quietly severed their association. Within 6 months, Escudero's equestrian empire was in freefall. He dropped the lawsuit and retreated from public view. The horse he had tried to buy for marketing purposes became the symbol of everything he lacked: decency, loyalty, a heart that could not be bought. The village celebrated in its own quiet way. On a Sunday morning in early spring, the priest held a special blessing for Sombra in the village square. The entire community attended, and Charlotte, now 3 years old, sat on the horse's broad back for the very first time, held steady by her father's hands. Sombra stood as still as a statue, his ears swiveling to catch the sound of her laughter. The photograph taken that day ran in the regional newspaper under a single word: familiar. True to the promise they had made on the morning the story broke, the family built Sombra a heated stall, a shelter insulated against the mountain cold with its own small heater running off a solar panel. In the corner of the stall, they placed a bed of fresh straw deep enough for a child to sleep in, just in case. The stall became a pilgrimage site. Families drove up the winding road from as far away as Madrid and Bordeaux, bringing carrots and apples, asking to see the horse who brought her home. Sombra accepted the treats with equanimity and the attention with indifference. He had never cared about fame. He had only done what his nature demanded. Charlotte grew, and the story grew with her. She learned to walk, then run, then ride. By the time she was 7, she could saddle Sombra herself, leading the old gelding through the village while neighbors smiled and waved. Every year, on the anniversary of the night she was lost, the family held a small ceremony at dawn. They would stand in the paddock as the first light touched the mountain ridge, and Charlotte would feed Sombra a carrot from her hand, and Mateo would say a quiet word of thanks to whatever force had guided a horse through the darkness to find his daughter. The legend of Sombra became part of the valley's identity, passed down to children who had not yet been born when the story first broke. But the most surprising detail only emerged years later, long after the cameras had gone. In the end, the horse who brought her home brought something else too, something no one had seen coming. That invisible gift Sombra brought was a reminder that the line between human and animal is thinner than we pretend. In the years after the story broke, something shifted in that remote valley. The village, once a collection of isolated farms, became a community bound by a shared experience of wonder. People who had lived as neighbors for decades without truly knowing one another now stopped on the road to talk. They checked on each other's children. They looked out for the old and the vulnerable. The horse had not just saved a little girl. He had reawakened a sense of collective responsibility that had been quietly fading for generations, and the ripples spread further. Dr. Rios published her research on Sombra, documenting the case as one of the clearest examples of equine protective intelligence ever recorded. Her work helped shift the way veterinary schools across Europe taught animal cognition. Within a few years, new protocols were established for recognizing and preserving the bonds formed between therapy animals and the people they serve. Clara Valls, with the family's blessing, started a small foundation in her daughter's memory, funded by donations from people who had heard Sombra's story and wanted to support similar connections. The foundation paid for therapy horses in rural communities where such resources had never existed before. What does it mean when a creature with no language, no concept of duty, no promise of reward, chooses to stand between a child and death? Perhaps it means that compassion is not uniquely human, that the impulse to protect the vulnerable runs deeper than our species, deeper than our understanding. The old gelding did not think about fame or money. He simply saw a small, shivering life and decided it was worth saving. And in doing so, he reminded a divided world of something essential. Sometimes the quietest heroes are the ones we walk past every day without seeing. If this story stayed with you, hit subscribe and join us for more true tales of unlikely heroes. Drop a comment letting us know where in the world you're watching from. And the next time you pass a quiet old horse in a field, maybe stop and look a little closer. You never know what kind of heart is beating beneath that dusty coat.